to welcome all of you here. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you on behalf of BRE Bank and CASE, Center for Social and Economic Research, to the Jubilee 100 BRE-CASE seminar. There are so many prominent guests here that I will not even try to name them, because evidently I would certainly miss someone. We are extremely grateful to Professor Goodhart for accommodating this one-day trip to Warsaw in his busy schedule.
So, conclusions. And here's I stop. I've already gone through much of it. We're going to return to retail banking with much less access to the wholesale markets, less globalization, more host country control, perhaps, and I would hope, much more counter-cyclical control over credit and asset price cycles, control over leverage applied to all intermediaries who are highly leveraged and big. I expect that we will get a twin peak approach to financial regulation, with the macro-prudential instruments which relate to leverage and rates of growth of credit expansion being undertaken by the central bank, and the micro-prudential instruments, that's effectively Basel II, remaining within the FSA. Now I end by saying I think it will be broadly favourable to Poland. The reason I end by saying that is that you are a country where the banking system is dominated by subsidiaries of foreign banks. And what I am saying is that until now, the trend has been sort of for home country control and allow the global banks to do whatever they like, wherever they like it. And countries which have been dominated by foreign-owned banks have been, shall we say, a little bit hesitant about that. I think that the world will change, because in a world in which institutions are national, it's very difficult to run a purely global system without potentially running into crisis conditions such as we've had. I think that there will be a tendency under these circumstances that have occurred in the last 2 years to realize that simply for self-protection there needs to be a much greater shift of control mechanisms towards the host country, which in your case is your host country. Okay? Here we are.
Now, maybe before the questions from the audience, let me ask you a couple of questions myself. First of all, about the pro-cyclical doomsday machine, i.e. Basel II. Do you think it's pretty much a relic, given what we have seen over the past 12 or so months, 18 months? Is Basel II over? And I know that you are trying to be very politically correct about cross-border regulation, but is that pretty much a gone-by notion? And thirdly, are we going to see return back to 18th century banking, where the volume of loans is a direct function of the volume of deposits, at least in the near future?
Thank you very much. On originate to distribute, you are absolutely correct that the banks are going to be required to hold a proportion of what they then distribute and securitize. So they'll be required to hold something like 5%. I would just, however, note that many of the banks who got into real trouble were those who kept a proportion of the securitized assets on their own books. I notably UBS, and they weren't keeping the toxic waste, they were keeping the best stuff in their books. And it was because of this curvature of the risk-weight curve that they really got clobbered. So, and it's not, I'm all in favor of giving banks an incentive to undertake due diligence and the rest of it. But you don't necessarily want them to hold too much to their own books. And remember that Northern Rock collapsed because it failed to securitize this stuff, because it had to keep too much on its own books. And remember that one of the reasons for securitization is that these mortgages have got a 20-year life, or 30-year life. And banks really ought not to be holding 20 to 30-year assets against the backing of liabilities which are at sight or short notice. So in many ways I think that despite the requirement that will come down the road to hold a proportion of the securitized assets on their own books, and I don't dissent from it all, that it's still going to be securitization. Now, is Basel II over? I don't think it is. I think the Basel II have a great deal of good thinking behind it. But the good thinking was almost entirely on the question of the individual bank. It wasn't of the system. The problem is that there are two ways of looking at risk. There's looking at the risk of the individual bank, qua individual bank, and looking at what is happening to the system as a whole. What you need for systemic stability is banks which are different. And that is quite separate from looking at individual banks. So that when you look at the system as a whole, you have to have a very different mindset from when you look at a bank as an individual institution. And that was one of the problems with the way that supervision and regulation has been done up till now. It has looked far too much at the individual bank, and it hasn't looked at the system as a whole. That needs to be changed. But Basel II is not over, because it is still right to look at individual banks as individual banks. Now, are we going back to the 18th century, in which loans depend on the availability of deposits? Well, I think to some extent, yes, and that's part of the problem. The immediate problem. In the longer run, I think maybe it's healthy, because the wholesale markets have been shown to be uncertain. You can't rely on them. People until 2 years ago thought you could. You can't rely on wholesale markets to provide your funding liquidity. Not completely. So I think it is a good idea to go back towards retail. I tell my central bank friends who worry about the present situation, and they do. They say, don't worry. You as central bankers are now become, once again, you're going to become the biggest bank in the whole of the country. You're going to become the biggest institution. If things go well, you will make the biggest profits. You are going to be terribly important people, much more important people than you've ever been before. Now, whether they take much comfort from that, I'm not so sure.